Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Yerkes, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we're here today to discuss a very important issue, which is how can policy mitigate climate vulnerability in the Middle East? The topic that we're discussing stems from work that Carnegie has been engaged in, and which has been published in our new compendium entitled Climate Change in the Middle East and North Africa, Mitigating Vulnerabilities and Designing Effective Policies. Several of the articles from the compendium are now available on the Carnegie website. I encourage you to check them out. Each of them is really fascinating and deals with a different topic in this broader area. And today we have a fabulous panel, I think, especially because it is a panel full of women who are here to discuss this topic. And the three speakers we will be hearing from shortly are each authors of one of the compendium pieces. They will be discussing their recent findings as well as the broader issue of policy and climate vulnerability. The speakers joining us today are Reem Halaseh, an urbanist specializing in sustainable urban development and urban climate resilience, in addition to integrating and localizing the Sustainable Development Goals. Our second speaker is Shada El-Sharif, who is the founder and senior advisor at Sustain MENA, where she leads advisory and awareness-raising activities on the green economy, climate, and sustainability in Jordan and the Middle East North Africa region. And then finally, Dina Zayed, who is an independent consultant and strategist working at the intersections of climate adaptation policies, international development, and public participation. And now let me turn it over to my colleague, Joy Arkeh, who is a research assistant in the Middle East program, as well as the author of one of the papers in the compendium. And Joy's piece will be published later this week. So Joy, over to you.
Hi, all. It's great to have you here today. If we can start with each person discussing the relationship between climate change and socioeconomic vulnerability in the MENA region, that would be great, specifically in what ways climate shapes vulnerability, how this has informed governance on climate as it relates to human security, economic opportunity, resilient infrastructure, and policy effectiveness.
Shall I start?
Yeah, Reem, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy, for the question. And thanks for letting me have this opportunity as well. So as you mentioned, climate change is a pressing issue exacerbating socioeconomic vulnerabilities in the MENA region. The region is already grappling with political instability, and now socioeconomic challenges have escalated dramatically. These include poverty, unemployment, reliance on fossil fuels, disrupt in governments, growing inequalities, and environmental challenges such as resource depletion and reduced precipitation, wildfires, and desertification. These factors are impacting food security and stability in the region. Moreover, climate change is intensifying existing climate-related hazards like extreme temperatures, heat waves, floods, droughts, sandstorms, and snowstorms as well. This is further straining already depleted natural resources, including water, forests, and ecosystems. Climate change contributes to intensifying protracted crises and conflicts in the region, as seen with the massive displacement in Palestine and Sudan. It has also exacerbated the economic burdens in countries like Lebanon, for example, and put more burden to significant influx of refugees in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Recent events such as floods in Libya and drought in Tunisia illustrate the severe impact of climate-related events. Socioeconomic vulnerability makes certain groups more vulnerable to the effects of climate change in the MENA region. In rural areas, climate change affects availability of natural resources and access to public services, impacting livelihoods and exacerbating poverty, inequality, and unemployment. This has led to increased rural urban migration and internal displacement, as seen in countries like Sudan, Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan. Urbanization is another critical factor, with 55% of the world's population currently living in urban settings and expected to rise to 68% by 2050. Also, in the MENA region, urbanization is even more pronounced. This rapid urbanization brings substantial social, economic, and environmental transformations. Urban and peri-urban areas accommodate concentrated human activities, putting more pressure on urban systems and infrastructure, government resources, and also the adaptive capacities of systems and also communities to climate hazards. Governments globally and in the MENA region are becoming increasingly aware of the correlation between climate change and socioeconomic challenges. There is a growing recognition of the need of substantial practices and integrated and innovative solutions to address these complex challenges. Effective strategies and actionable policies are essential in these uncertain times, requiring multilateral and multi-sectoral solutions to stress both governmental and community resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem. Dina, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you so much, Joy, and welcome to our audience. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Without repeating some of the great points that Reem has already shared, I think it's important to take a step back and initially say that climate change and climate vulnerability is socio-relational at its core, and it's not possible for us to understand climate change without understanding socioeconomic vulnerability, nor is it possible for us to understand socioeconomic vulnerability without centering climate change. Worldwide, and I think especially in the region that is warming twice as fast as the global average, as climate change accelerates, we will witness more extreme weather patterns, more frequent and intense disasters, and consequent environmental justice and health burdens. As Reem has already mentioned, society's most vulnerable members often bear the brunt of these increased risks. At this stage, we have unquestionable evidence that allows us to plainly observe that when we have extreme weather events, for instance, they have varied effects, and this reflects a wider growing understanding that vulnerability to climate change is shaped by social, economic, historic, and political factors. It operates at multiple scales and intersects in different ways. Vulnerability is multidimensional, it's dynamic, and how physical exposure to a hazard shapes vulnerability rests on the pre-existing conditions that we have in any given community. Many of our audience members may have seen a few days ago that the city of Aswan in Egypt hit a record 50 degrees Celsius. Now, how those 50 degrees are experienced depends on your ability to access resources like cooling, shelter, infrastructure that keeps you in the shade, offers you clean water, and so on. It's also shaped by the ability to access and influence governance norms and decisions, as well as the nature of your cultural and social networks of support, or your knowledge on how to navigate an extreme heat wave. An affluent urban residents with access to air conditioning and who can afford a higher electricity bill is experiencing this heat wave potentially as an inconvenience. But what a migrant day laborer having to work in the sun and completely dependent on that day wage to feed a family of 14, all while working in a sector in which a heat shock destroys an entire season's worth of farming effort and damages a crop, they are experiencing the same heat wave as a major and potentially life-changing economic setback. Now, if we imagine a scenario even further in which this same migrant day laborer has a health condition that pre-exposes him or her to a heat stroke requiring hospitalization, which they may not be able to have access to because that hospital may be thousands of kilometers away from the nearest point which their farm is located. In that scenario, this same heat wave is a potentially life-threatening and life-ending event. So putting all of this into context is to say that also the repetition, the frequency, and the ability of these different groups to recover from one shock to the next is shaped by those variations. We have evidence, for instance, cited in Egypt's official assessments that vulnerability to extreme heat days in the southern parts of the country has increased from 50 days a year 3 decades ago to 69 in the most recent assessment. That's nearly 20% of the year of extreme heat, often occurring at moments of time and in which local communities and local authorities don't have historic experience in navigating. What all of this means is that at its core, vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity in any effort to address climate change or to reduce vulnerability has to understand the root causes of why people are vulnerable in the first place. So to tackle the second part of your question, Joy, if we're also to stay in the case of Egypt, this is a country considered among the world's most vulnerable to climate change, where in a scenario of a global 1 meter sea level rise, over 10% of Egypt's population would be affected, and 15% of its agricultural land would be lost. We have all sorts of figures that we see floating around on how over 10 million Egyptians at a minimum are at risk, how historic cities like Alexandria may vanish, and Egypt's own national communications to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change ranks the country as the second most exposed in the world in terms of coastal populations affected and a third for the proportion of its gross domestic product at risk under a 1 meter sea level rise scenario. We also know that some sectors are more disproportionately at risk than others. Coastal zones, agriculture, and water, for example, all top that. But the reality, and to reinforce the point that Reem has made earlier, is that most of our understanding and the work that currently exists in the region to address climate change vulnerability by net dollars has focused on major infrastructural interventions and prioritized a reading of climate change as an external biophysical threat rather than taking a view that seeks to tackle why people are vulnerable in the first place. This applies wholesale across the Middle East region, and this is quite ironic because this is a highly unequal region with some of the world's richest populations who have amassed their wealth from the hydrocarbon industry, and they live side by side with some of the world's most vulnerable groups. The Middle East and North Africa is home to some of the wealthiest per capita states in the world, and some of you may be aware that the 3 richest individuals in the region have more wealth than the bottom 222.5 million poor citizens of the region combined. So just as we mentioned this case of extreme heat in Aswan, an Emirati or Saudi family that has vast fortunes because of their leadership roles in national oil production companies can escape the worst of heat by spending summers in Paris and London. But the region's 12.6 million internally displaced people and 2.4 million refugees do not have this option. And as Reem mentioned, we should also stress that this region is home to the highest global share of refugee and internally displaced people anywhere in the world. And that in 2021 alone, nearly 3 million people were forced to leave their homes due to natural disasters and climate-induced events. So against this very intuitive need to center variation and vulnerability, what we have seen across the region is almost a systematic deprioritization of research and policy interventions that treat climate change as a social science problem, that engages with the multidimensional nature of vulnerability, and that even attempts to methodologically and holistically map some of these underlying sources of vulnerability and engage with climate change for what it is, a matter of politics, a matter of power and decisions about power, a matter of models of capitalist extraction that have shaped legacies of inequality and resource deprivation, and a matter of justice. By and large, we have a very thin social science interrogation of the political dynamics that underpin climate vulnerability both in Egypt and the Middle East region more widely. Social science literature on climate adaptation and climate governance in the region is limited against the scale of the problem, and this requires an urgent change in how we budget for research, for programs, and how those budgets are both earmarked and targeted. So to close here, what I will say is until we begin to grapple with questions of vulnerability for whom, we actually know very little about climate change and its impacts in the region. Our policy effectiveness, our development budgets, and our large-scale mega infrastructural interventions can only go so far if we are not examining the social conditions that shape adaptive responses to climate change.
Thank you so much for that, Dina. Shada, please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Joy, and I'll be doing my best with the voice limitations today. Thank you so much for having me. I guess both Dina and Reem have done a great job at giving sort of the view from the region. If I may actually zoom out before later on zooming into Jordan, I was looking at the outcomes from the latest IPCC reports, both on mitigation and adaptation. And I think it's very important to recognize that, already we're at a 1.1 warmer planet. even though we're still having conversations about limiting to 1.5 or 2. What this actually means is, there's this global transition that needs to happen. I'm just putting this in context because what I say here really affects the trajectory of development in our region. So we're talking about a 43% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Now, if you look at the findings from the IPCC report on adaptation and vulnerability, there is this very clear recognition of intersectionality with socioeconomic development, governance, and all forms of inequality. And of course, I want to add, excuse me, when we talk about inequality, of course, colonialism and war are some of the boldest representations of inequality. And that, of course, engenders the most vulnerable groups. And so that's where obviously efforts should turn towards when we talk about adaptation and vulnerability. Another important finding is that globally, we see work happening on adaptation, but it is not on an integrated sort of level. So there needs to be better integration between sectors. As mentioned by Dina, of course, vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And there is a big range of difference when it comes to those aspects within this region. Exposure is pretty high across the entire region, but the adaptive capacity is where you see the differences and where you see there an element of human intervention and an element of control. Of course, adaptation planning in the region has been very much on the shorter to medium terms rather than the long-term and more transformational sort of impacts. In any case, excuse me, the enabling conditions are the same, whether it comes to political commitment, follow through, the policies, institutions, mobilization of finance, and inclusivity in governance. Of course, what this means is involvement of all members of society in the development and implementation of policies relating to climate change adaptation. I think, Joy, I'm going to stop here. I'm not sure how clear the voice is, so I think I'm going to actually have to stop here and hopefully take questions as they come in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shada. Sarah, did you want to go ahead with questions, or I can get started too?
Sure. No, thank you so much. This has been a great way to start off. I think, you've all really highlighted this important issue, which is the intersectionality of climate and socioeconomic vulnerabilities and the various ways that it impacts people in the region. And, this is not unique to the MENA region as well. So maybe we can dive down a little bit. And before we do that, I just wanted to announce for those viewing that we will soon be taking questions from the audience. And so if you want to submit questions, please do. There's a way to do that on YouTube in the YouTube chat function. So just type your question in there and those questions will get to us. And please do that, all along, and we will take some of those questions shortly. But first, I'll start back with Reem again. You talked quite a bit about these issues sort of on a more regional level. And can you drill down into Jordan a little bit and talk about how climate has impacted Jordan's urban infrastructure and what the implications are for social and economically vulnerable groups specifically in Jordan? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Actually, when we talk about Jordan, let me just give an overview about vulnerable groups in Jordan. Recent statistics show that unemployment rate in Jordan has reached 21.4% during the first quarter of this year, with slightly above 700,000 refugees residing in the country. And also in 2019, the government reported a poverty rate of 15.7%. And additionally, the people with disabilities account for 11.2% of Jordan's population. So over the last decades, Jordan has experienced extreme climate events such as frequent heat waves, intense flash floods, and drought, which have led to water scarcity. And also we have different climate hazards correlated with the sandstorms, and snowstorms, affecting various areas differently. These climate-related hazards significantly impact urban systems, assets, and also communities. For example, when we take heat waves, for instance, place enormous pressure on urban infrastructure by increasing electricity and water demand. This strain often results in power shortages and sometimes blackouts. Moreover, the heightened demand for drinking water, domestic use, and irrigation exacerbates water scarcity issues, specifically in Jordan. Heat waves also elevate the risk of food and waterborne diseases and facilitate the spread of vector-borne diseases as well. So, and vulnerable groups, including those with serious health issues, such as non-communicable diseases and people with disabilities, are particularly affected, especially those relying on artificial lands. Going to another climate hazard, which is flash floods. Flash floods have caused severe damage to stormwater infrastructure and networks in Jordan and also for properties. For example, the flood in 2019 in Amman damaged the downtown area, including the prominent archaeological site of the Roman theater, as Dina mentioned, in Aswan, and how the archaeological sites are also impacted by climate hazards. More recently, intense flash floods have been deteriorating Petra and impacting tourism and livelihoods of people living in south of Jordan. Health implications is also a concern after floods events, where spread of vector-borne diseases increase as well. Going to another climate hazard, which is drought. Drought poses a significant challenge to Jordan, one of the world's most water-stressed countries, also characterized by below average precipitation and declining water levels in surface and groundwater resources. Droughts lead to irregular water supply and increased water prices, which also contribute to socioeconomic vulnerabilities in specific areas as well. These water shortages exacerbate socioeconomic vulnerabilities, particularly for marginalized communities. I know Shada will talk more also about Jordan, so I'll leave the floor to Shada and Dina also to mention more.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll give Shada a little bit more of a voice break here and turn it over to Dina with a question about another really important actor, which is civil society. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of civil society in driving climate change action, both at the level of Egypt, but also more regionally as well?
Thank you so much for this question. And I'll try to pick up on some of the important points that Reem has also raised and draw some connections here. But first, maybe take a bit of a step back and ask the question of what is the role of civil society in general in driving climate action, so outside of the region, and looking at this sort of from a bird's eye view. We know from the latest 2022 IPCC report on climate impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability that inclusive governance that prioritizes equity and justice and climate action leads to more effective and sustainable outcomes. We also know as development practitioners, many of us in this room, that working on climate change requires a commitment to participation. It's not particularly controversial to say that adapting to climate change or targeting the causes of climate change or addressing some of these very complex manifestations and impacts that Reem, for instance, has described in Jordan, requires rebuilding and transforming our very political and economic systems, and system change needs people. We cannot adapt to climate change without people whose lives and livelihoods will be affected, and they simply need to have a say. So in very straightforward language, we have to create broad and sustained public and stakeholder engagement around potentially major policy shifts. And what that means is that there is consistent and clear evidence that tells us, here again, sort of to come back to some of the points that will be discussed in the introduction, that climate change and especially adaptation affects groups differently. And for decisions to be just, they need to incorporate fair procedures. Those have to include transparent and participatory mechanisms to make sure that diverse actors are appropriately represented and they have a voice in shaping their own realities and at times diagnosing things in more accurate ways. And from that perspective, there's a perception and understanding that civil society acts as an essential bridge between the public and the state. They can hold governments to account, they can work on advocating for policy changes, they can speak on behalf of citizens. Civil society facilitates engagement and understanding of climate issues, and the sector can, by and large, ensure the independent collection and tracking of data. So as climate change and its long-term impacts implies policy shifts, we need an empowered civil society that's capable of shaping and pushing for participatory processes that, in theory, could help us make better decisions, support collective problem solving, reflect citizen needs, and achieve equitable outcomes. Now, bringing this a little bit to Egypt, and I think some of these lessons are more widely applicable to the region, we see from the Egyptian National Climate Change Strategy 2050 that there is a clear mention of vital partnerships with civil society. The government expects civil society to engage the public and help promote climate resilient social behavior. So against this very clear global expectation, and the one that exists also within Egypt on the role of civil society, my paper and contribution to this compendium aim to question what does that look like in environments where civil society faces structural restrictions, like more challenging legal and bureaucratic rules that prevent civil society groups from accessing funding or operating, or in the civil society groups are operating in political contexts where security intervention, meddling, and backlash form a very real and very daily consideration for their advocacy efforts. We saw both in COP27 and COP28, a lot of international criticism on some of the civil society restrictions in the Arab world and across the Middle East region that have allowed some in the international community to describe a closed or more restricted civic space that threaten the credibility of the hosts, that force us to really have tough conversations on the relationship between human rights and climate change and so on. But one of the things that my paper argued is that we need to move away from idealized and abstracted perceptions of what civil society is and is not, and what civil society does and does not do, and instead engage with the realities on the ground. I believe that in the case of Egypt and in the case of the Middle East, there is a very clear civil society network operating around issues of environment and climate change. They may appear weak, they may look fragmented, and they may not have the ability to mobilize public attention and advocacy against the scale of climate vulnerability, but that doesn't mean they do not exist. My paper argues that while it may appear that civil society groups in Egypt have little voice and ability to work on climate change, that view is likely premature because their capacity to mobilize as well as to avert restrictions is not uniformly distributed. We have to be careful in describing a singular homogeneous civil society field. So building on analysis of a variety of civil society responses, interviews conducted over the period of 2017 to 2022, and my own professional and participatory experience, it seems clear that the legal and the security restrictions we see in Egypt matter, and they matter very much. But they do not prevent the existence of civil society groups. Instead, what we see is civil society groups have found creative ways to network, to organize, to find each other, as well as to find counterparties within the government to do some very difficult work, which they barely have any structural, long-term material resources for. Civil society groups in Egypt are players, even if we don't yet know how to spot them, and the diversity in approaches that they adopt. And so I look at the different spaces and narratives that civil society groups in Egypt find for themselves and to be able to do their work. And the message I'd like to leave here with the audience and to kind of bring this to a bit of a close is that, and I think it's a message that resonates across the region, is that we have historically underinvested in building civil society capacity on climate change action in the Middle East. And as a result, it may be difficult for us to find a one-stop list of entities working on climate change, both locally and regionally. But that means we have to adopt a different gaze. Instead of paying exclusive attention to large-scale NGOs and visible initiatives, we have to get better at spotting small-scale, diverse, diffused, and fragmented civil society landscapes, as well as respect when they do not wish to be found or spotted. So my paper looks at this dynamic of organizations registering themselves, for instance, as social enterprises, or working in close contact with government officials as policy advisors, facilitators of workshops, frontline agents of policy, and participants in key policy dialogues. And all in all, what it means is that if we are to seriously understand the role civil society plays across the region and do a better job at supporting this civil society, we need to pay attention to the fact that a lot of important work is carried out on the ground, but it doesn't always have a climate tag. And we also need to get better at tracking and documenting these efforts and learning how to back them up and help them on their own terms.
Great, thank you. That was really helpful and a lot of very practical and I think doable ideas for policymakers as well. One question for you, Shada, before we open it up to some audience questions. And again, just to remind everyone, please submit your questions into YouTube chat if you have them, which is returning to Jordan. How do pre-existing vulnerabilities in Jordan, particularly poverty, water and food insecurity, and health issues, exacerbate the different issues of climate change on vulnerable societal groups?
Thanks so much, Sarah. So just building off of what Reem has really clearly outlined in terms of what Jordan is going to see or is starting to see as a result of climate change, it's really the higher temperatures, the drier climate, the extreme weather events on both extremes, more droughts and more frosts. We've spoken to many farmers, particularly in the olive industry and the olive oil industry, that are so vulnerable to frost and are losing hundreds of thousands annually in their businesses. And really, these are businesses that have been handed down from generations, are actually, some of them closing due to climate change. I also want to mention, of course, one of our most vulnerable demographics, which is refugees, as a result of successive wars in the region, from Palestine to Iraq to Syria. Today, 1 in 5 people you meet in Jordan is a refugee. And so those groups, be it farmers, refugees, those in poverty pockets, women, people with disabilities that are inherently vulnerable, are the ones that are also most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. The good news is that a lot of our policy work has involved these groups. For example, Jordan's Green Growth National Action Plan has a very clear focus on social inclusivity, and particularly women, young people, and people with disabilities. Same goes for our climate change policy up to 2050. So this bodes well. However, we need to see better translation of these policies into systematic operational engagement frameworks that happen regularly and institutionally, and not just sort of when a new report is coming up or when there's a new strategy, for example. It really needs to be part and parcel of the regular policymaking exercise. So what we see, for example, even though the country has a pretty advanced governance framework, the strategies, the policies, the climate change bylaw, what's missing really is more of a nexus approach, because Jordan, as Reem mentioned, is resource insecure in a sense when it comes to water, energy, and food. And this was very much pronounced during the COVID-19 crisis. And so, building security in these resources is a developmental priority, but it's also obviously a climate adaptation priority for Jordan. Finally, one of the points I made in my paper with Dr. Marwan for the compendium is that this policy and governance transition has to happen at all levels of governance. So not just the national government, but of course also the regional governments, municipal, city, and village level even. And this is actually where the civil society comes in very strongly, not only in supporting policy development, but in some instances, actual implementation of solutions on the ground, because a lot of them tend to have the tools and the ability to reach local communities that can co-create innovative solutions together. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much all for your needed insights. It's definitely crucial to remember that climate is not just about environmental mitigation, but also systematic change that should include affected people at the micro level. And hopefully MENA governments can continue to head in a direction where inequality and integration of sectors is the cornerstone of governance and adaptation. I'd like to move on to questions submitted that I will read out loud. And I think this is directed towards Reem, but please feel free to pitch in everyone else. The question is, are there any efforts from MENA city governments to enforce building retrofits or improvements and resilience improvements? Is there information on trends of private owners to improve resilience of their properties? And how would you describe the private sector's awareness of incoming climate risks?
Thank you, Joy. I'm going to be brief, actually. Greater Amman municipality has provided actually incentives for using renewable energy in Amman specifically, and even at the national level as well. And also retrofitting buildings and to use green building practices as well. Decarbonization efforts are always having this wide trend in Amman, and also water management practices. Definitely, awareness campaigns are there. Private sector is highly now engaged in climate action in general. And Amman municipality is also working on new strategies to engage private sector more in climate action and resilience in creating urban resilience as well. If Shada would like to also come in and
no, thank you, Reem. I think you covered it very well.
Thank you. So the next question, we'll see if folks are able to answer this. It's a bit technical, but feel free to sort of broaden your responses a bit here, which is, how do you see governments and or civil society using mechanisms like the Open Government Partnership, OGP Local, or other good governance development initiatives to advance climate change reforms, particularly in OGP countries like Morocco and Jordan? Do you see additional opportunities to invest in climate change resilience through these mechanisms? So maybe, Dina, if you want to start and just sort of speak to whatever aspects of that you can, and we'll have Shada and Reem come in as well.
Sure. That's a really excellent question, and I think an interesting one as well, because there's likely a huge amount of variation in the region, both in terms of the existence of digital infrastructure, and then the question becomes about who has the capacity to influence and shape some of these conversations, and centering some of what we've already been discussing about variation and vulnerability. Are these governance innovations open to the poorest of the poor? Are they open to rural and refugee and internally displaced populations? Are they who benefits from some of these collaborations and these sort of co-produced policy innovations would be a fundamental question that we probably don't really have enough research on to be able to meaningfully answer. In the case of Egypt, there was some experimentation with using digitally mediated consultation mechanisms when the country was looking through the SDG 2030 strategy. So as a way to solicit and bring in citizen input into setting the sustainable development goals and sustainable development goals for 2030, there was a very interesting open platform, open government mechanism that was launched and released, and it worked quite well. Statistically, against a population of 100 million, there are some questions there about, again, who participated and to what end, but the existence of the platform itself was quite important. I think we've also seen other examples where civil society groups, so going to the point that I was describing about thinking about civil society as fragmented and diffused, there are some existing efforts, not yet fully scaled and not yet fully supported, but some existing efforts to look at some mapping around initiatives, civil society initiatives in the region, what kind of coalitions exist, what kinds of groups operate at a grassroots level, at a local level. Some of this work, which is just it's just beginning, is being led by a particular startup that's seeking to examine, identify initiatives in Egypt and across the region, and their work has not been made public yet. But these types of innovations do exist. We just don't have enough data about their scale or applicability. But perhaps Reem and Shada have other examples also from Jordan that they can pull in.
Shada, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, sure, no problem. I want to come in much more than I can, but I'm just having to be brief today. But in general, from this, OGP, what I get, the spirit of it is really all about, partnerships, transparency, openness. And I definitely see a move towards that in governance in Jordan and across the region. So for example, with Jordan's economic modernization vision, for the first time, you have an economic planning framework that has an online website where any citizen can go in and see the progress on different projects. So this is, a heartening development, but we're still not at a stage where maybe there's a two-way conversation. And that's, I think, where we need to get to. And I think we can learn a lot from academia, where open innovation sort of systems have been in place for a while in trying to link, industry solutions to the academic sector and vice versa. I think this is a good time now to bring in community and society into this open innovation. What I think is also a very supportive trend is the growing entrepreneurship ecosystem and community in the region. You see this call towards climate hackathons, really engaging young people in local communities and women in solving a lot of our climate and green challenges. So I think it's a matter really of connecting the dots between government, academia, young people. Civil societies can certainly be that sort of enabler and conduit facilitator of those kinds of dialogues. And of course, this global trend towards digitization can really make it easier to exchange knowledge and use different types of data platforms for co-creation of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shada. We have another question that just came in on mentioning the protests in Algeria against the lack of water, and if there have been any demonstrations in Jordan and Egypt against the government policies and management of climate-related issues. If Dina or Reem, you would like to tackle that.
I don't think we reached to a point that we have demonstrations, but I think the citizens are questioning, actually. Even when you go to any debate or when you look at the water situation in Jordan, I think everyone is questioning and correlating everything together, to have this specifically when everyone is questioning about the economic opportunities in Jordan. Also, they're questioning about the water security and food security in Jordan as well. I don't know, Shada, if you want to add anything.
Maybe just briefly to say, on top of the role of civil society in oversight, we see even Parliament playing a bigger role now in questioning policies and government, when it comes to climate and water, because we have a newly established Environment and Climate Committee inside our Parliament, and we see an interest in climate issues for the upcoming parliamentary elections in September. So I see this rising as an issue of interest for the population and broader government arms. And also the Senate in Jordan put out a paper on a just green transition. So this shows me that these issues are really being picked up now, not purely just by the government. They're not a government-led conversation anymore. It's starting to become more people-led as well, even through Parliament and other strands of the public sphere. Thank you.
If I can just also jump in to make a minor point on the question of mobilization and protests. I think here is an example, actually a very clear example of being aware that often climate change manifests in different issues in different sectors. So I think in a way where, and I am by no means have the figures or statistics off the top of my head, but there were periods over the course of the last decade in Egypt where we saw an increased frequency of small mobilization movements, protests against water access, issues of sanitation, issues of water. But those are not, in the community's mind, they're not using the language around climate change. So there is really a question here about what we track as climate related and what we track as governance failures. So from the perspective of those that were mobilizing around issues of water, it was an issue of local government, issue of, in their minds, corruption, issue of access, rather than an issue of climate. And I think this actually reinforces the point quite strongly on the interdependence of pre-existing socioeconomic vulnerability and its relationship to climate change.
Another question that has come in which is a topic you've all briefly touched on, which is this idea of unemployment and sort of job loss as one of the challenges, one of the socioeconomic challenges in the region. How would you sort of describe the intersection between both job loss related to climate change, but also job opportunity? Do you see employment policies as the government trying to address the employment challenge through climate change in both positive and negative ways? And Shada, why don't we start with you?
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I mean, on the jobs question, it's actually the biggest pain point for the economy in Jordan. And Reem mentioned, 20% unemployment. If you look at youth unemployment on its own, it's actually closer to 50%. Even women's labor force participation is extremely low in Jordan, at 14%. So these two issues are really interlinked. And there is now a recognition that really green jobs is a really strategic direction for a country like Jordan. And what we mean by green jobs is really looking at the definition that the ILO has put out, that they need to be jobs that are decent when it comes to inclusivity and all the kinds of health and safety provisions. But at the same time, they either result in a greener process or a greener output. And we're seeing a huge potential for greening existing jobs or creating new green jobs. But the bigger opportunity lies in the greening of existing jobs, which requires a huge capacity building and a huge transition focus. And this is why really I believe the just transition conversation is taking place in Jordan, because it's going to be really much more about transitioning existing industries and a little bit about innovating new industries like green hydrogen or electric cars and things that are coming up. So with an economic modernization vision saying Jordan needs to create 1 million jobs in 10 years, the latest green jobs assessment is estimating around at least 100,000 green jobs in just a few investments. This is a very conservative estimate. More sectors are being studied in Jordan right now, so the number could actually be much higher. This is similar for the investment target. So for a country like Jordan, green can definitely deliver economic benefits for jobs and for investments. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to come in on the jobs question?
Thank you so much, Shada. There's a question for you, Dina, on your experience with civil society and whether they're allowed to truly engage in expressing their views transparently and how that varies across the region.
I think this is a really interesting question, and thank you to the audience member that raised it. There are a couple of things worth saying here, and this is sort of discussed in more depth in the paper, so I'll try to be as brief as possible in the interest of time. But I think what we observe with civil society mobilization is, rather than a narrative that presumes an absence or an inability to engage the government around civil society, is that it's actually complicated, it's fluid, and there's a fragmented landscape of engagement. I think I mentioned this in the previous response, that we saw, for instance, a very, let's say, active conversation ahead of COP27 and COP28 that was looking at the state of civil society in the region and lamenting the landscape of restrictions It is a fact that civil society groups face difficult security, legal, and bureaucratic challenges, not just in Egypt, but many countries in the region and to varying degrees. But overall, we also have limited research on CSO engagement with climate change and efforts to map and understand current patterns of national and regional policy advocacy and what public-facing awareness initiatives look like, and that research agenda is really underdeveloped. So one of the things that I look at in my work and my research is that we need to get better at understanding how civil society groups engage and for whom. One of the patterns that we observe is that actually there is a trend where some groups prefer to operate below the radar. They deliberately pick issues that don't involve direct conflict or direct dialogue with the government. They don't want to express their views with the government. In some of these cases, their main focus is to interact with each other, is to build community and associational power. It's about sharing and developing knowledge, about expressing community solidarity and developing social welfare networks. I can provide a concrete example of my research in Alexandria, where one group helped develop small-scale emergency lighting systems for informal, very poor communities. These groups did not want to come into contact with the government because that actually allows them to preserve their own adaptive abilities to climate change, because if they did, then they would have to deal with questions on their land tenure and the fact that they are not actually paying for electric services, because from the government's perspective, they are living on illegal land. But there's also a response that we see again across the region, but that I can speak about with a bit more authority on the case of Egypt, where we see civil society groups able to play a very critical role in response to crises. If I stay in the example of Alexandria, where we saw after the 2015 flooding in the city, it was community associations that ended up mapping and developing policy recommendations, diagnosing what the issues that were facing the city, understanding that it was the absence of early warning systems and community engagement with weather information. And these groups had a capacity to convey that information in a critical juncture to key policy and key government officials, making a very direct and very consequential dent on the way in which city authorities later understood these types of events. The other thing that I will also say is that we see a very clear pattern of civil society groups who work informally with governments. So there's a policy window. Shada and Reem mentioned some of these examples. There might be a major policy report that's about to be launched, or there's a large-scale international initiative that's being negotiated. And in this, civil society partners may find that they have a window and an opportunity to contribute the views and contribute those often very critically, where the contestation is around policy views, but not around politics. And they support officials and the government, sometimes as consultants, as advisors, in different forms of capacities. So just to wrap this up a little bit, I think what we see and what these tactics have in common is that working with the grassroots is often the more challenging bit, rather than working with the government. And that often some of the engagement with the government is done when the opportunity presents itself, or it's done in a manner that doesn't attract security and political retaliation. So it has to be done carefully. Civil society groups might choose to avoid direct contestation and engage in ways that they find to be constructive. And that is a tactic of survival. And I think it's a tactic that we need to take very seriously. So I think just to say this very briefly, that there's an element of informality, and there is an element of ad hoc and arbitrary responses that shape how civil society groups can engage with government officials. And I think those dynamics need to be understood for what they are and not be treated as though they are inferior to other forms of civil society advocacy. And I'll stop there, and maybe Shada or Reem can also add something to this point.
Thank you so much. We are just about out of time, so I'm going to just ask if each of you has any last remarks that you want to say, anything that maybe we didn't get a chance to cover in 1 or 2 minutes. Why don't we start with you, Reem, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we don't have time, so I just want to point out on something that we do have strategies, and it's really crucial to have climate governance within cities and within governments. However, we need to have tangible and inclusive, effective projects and policy orientation for climate resilience and climate action in general.
Great, thank you. That's very, very brief and to the point. Shada, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think my last point would really be that, even though we have to work urgently on mitigation, I think we have to work just as urgently on climate resilient development in our region. And again, I say across all governance levels and sectors and timeframes, so short, medium, long, and across sectorally. And really what I want to mention in terms of the human resilient or climate resilient model is that putting humans back again at the center of all of our development, human health, well-being, equity, justice, really all of these values should guide our work. And that's automatically going to guide us to really concentrating our efforts towards the most vulnerable communities developmentally and when it comes to climate change. Thank you.
Fabulous, thank you. And Dina, over to you.
Thank you. I feel like I already used some of my time earlier, but I could just build on the 2 points that Reem and Shada made, and to say that it is very clear that we have a long way to go in the region to work on climate change and to tackle it meaningfully, and especially to work on resilience and resilient development pathways. But I don't think it's useful for us to diminish or undermine the work that does exist. And I think what I heard in common through each of our interventions is that we sometimes have to adapt our lens and to understand the ways groups navigate and they maneuver around the challenges that they face, recognize their efforts when they exist, but also to be mindful that long-term system change and just and equitable responses to climate change has to be accompanied by continued access to political resources like the capacity to be represented and to engage with decision makers. So we both need to celebrate what we have, but we also need to work a little bit harder at changing some of the ways in which we observe, study, and diagnose scale and replicability across the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this has just been a fabulous discussion, and I think we could probably go on for many more hours. But in that vein, please do read the papers that these fabulous panelists have written as part of the Carnegie Compendium series. There are more papers that are continuing to be published. There's quite a bit of great work that's being done on these important topics. So thank you so much to our fabulous panelists. Thank you to Joy for fabulous moderation. And thank you for the audience for some really great questions that came in during the panel as well. We really appreciate you all being with us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.